Welcome to Africa's LSP podcast, where we explore the world of translation, interpretation, and localization, as well as connect with the language industry's top players. From language service providers to the businesses and individuals who rely on their services, we'll be delving into the challenges, opportunities, and trends shaping the industry. Join us as we discover the power of language and the impact it has on connecting Africa and the world. Brought to you by Multilingual Consult and hosted by Nat Quintela. Africa's LSP podcast is the go-to podcast for all things language in Africa.
Hello there. This is Nat Quintela from Multilingual Consult, and I would like to welcome you once again to another episode of Africa's LSP podcast. Today we've been joined by another brilliant African language professional in the person of Christian Elongue from the Carbon Group. Hi Christian, thank you for agreeing to join us on this episode to share your insights about the language service industry. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Nat. It's a pleasure being here, and I look forward to engaging with you and the Multilingual team.
Right. So Christian's credentials are quite impeccable, I must say. And I'm afraid I may not do justice to it if I talk about it. So here's what we're going to do, Christian. I'll step back for a few minutes and let you take the opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them more about your background and expertise, right?
Okay. Hello to all who are following and listening to this podcast. Here is Christian Elongue. I am the Managing Director of Carbon Group, which is a language service provider. We are providing service in most of the languages that are known, such as French, English, Arabic, Portuguese, but we are mainly known for our services in African languages. And we also host a network of African language translators and teachers known as ALAT. It's a pleasure being here and to share about what we are doing and how together we can influence the language industry in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian, for sharing that with us. Like I said, Christian is a big man and he's only being modest here, but I'll find a way. I'll definitely find a way to expose him. In view of that, Christian, I'd like us to talk about another aspect of your work that you didn't mention, but is of interest to me. I'm referring to knowledge management. Can you tell us briefly what that's about?
Yes, indeed. I am a knowledge management consultant, and one of the primary goals of Kabod, which is the main organization, is to provide knowledge management services. So through knowledge management, our goal is to build legacy, to build system and structure that will help any business to strive and to be resilient, because we realize that most of the businesses or ministry in Africa were dying mostly after the founder is no longer there, or for other reasons because they are not putting in place system and structure to ensure that there is sustainability in terms of practices. So the goal of knowledge management is to develop, strong knowledge management system that will ensure continuity, that will ensure the preservation of institutional knowledge, and to help African organizations to become more innovative and resilient so that they can cope to change as they are growing. Thank you.
Great. So let's do knowledge management a bit for now. Tell us, how does your knowledge or should I say, your work in knowledge management inform your approach to providing language services? So what I'm basically asking is, how do you use knowledge management in providing language services?
Very interesting question. Indeed, as a primary knowledge management consultant and specialist, knowledge management is at the core of everything that we do internally and also through the various services that we provide. So when it comes to language services, we are using knowledge management, in a holistical way. And I'm going to share it, maybe, let's say, 5 key angles. The first one is at the level of identifying and prioritizing the language that we are focusing on. As we all know, there are many language service providers in Africa. So from a knowledge management perspective, we had to settle on the language that we want to focus on. And for example, even Multilingual, our host, has used knowledge management to inform its services. We all know that Multilingual has developed the Akan News website. Why is it that the Akan language has been chosen among most of the languages that are spoken in Ghana? I believe one of the reasons is the fact that it is a language that is mostly understood, that has a large demography of speakers. A second application of knowledge management in our work is at the level of the development of language resources. As we all know, knowledge management can help in developing dictionary, glossary, and translation memory, and we all know how those tools are helping to make translation faster. A third application of knowledge management to our language services is at the level of knowledge sharing and collaboration. For those who know Cabot Group Language Services, they know that we are highly focused on knowledge sharing. On a regular basis, we reach out to people who are doing tremendously well in advancing African languages, people who are creating tools to make African languages more usable, more accessible. And we have interview with them, we document the innovation that they have done, and we capture it through interview. Knowledge sharing also at the level of the network that we have created, the African Language Teachers and Translator Network, which is a platform where people join and they share opportunities in the language industry. They share, job opportunities, events, and many other things. A fourth application of knowledge management in the work of Cabot is at the level of technology. One of the three key pillars of knowledge management is technology. I will take two examples here in terms of machine translation and, natural language processing, where knowledge management is helping us to automate, most of the work that we do and to gain in efficiency. And finally, a fifth application of knowledge management in the work that we do is at the level of the adaptation of what we do to the local context, and I think here we see more about, cultural sensitivity. How do we ensure that the work that we are doing is understood by the people that we are reaching out to? So those are how knowledge management is currently being used to inform our approach and our services in the language industry in Africa.
Awesome. Moving away from knowledge management and talking about your work in general. As I have already mentioned, aside being the MD of Cabot Group, you do quite a number of other things. I mean, you're a KM consultant, an edtech researcher, a translator, and so on. I'm curious to know how you juggle all these things, but more importantly, how do you as an LSP stay up to date with industry trends and developments?
Okay, I think I would take this question on two levels. Number one, how am I able to manage various various responsibility in different industry. I think one of the way I've been doing it is that I have people I work with. I always believe that teamwork makes things work. So at the level of Cabot, there is a head of department for each of the three core pillars of service that we are providing. So that's basically how I'm able of doing different services, because there are people who are in charge and who are able of driving it with the best of their capacity. Now, how do I stay up to date, with industry trend and development? I think there are also 5 key ways that I can share concerning that. One of them is attending conferences and events, where you go to learn from what others are doing, what's happening in the industry, and so many other things. So it's basically about attending events where you know that people of your industry are present so that you can learn from them. The second way is by being part of a community, being part of association and network, where through this network you will find people who have like-minded interests. One of those networks which we belong to is the Interpretation and Translation Institute. They are more oriented towards training. They have a lot of training for translators and interpreters. We have also ALAT, which I have mentioned that Cabot is hosting. It's a LinkedIn-based group, and we also have a newsletter to all the members of the group. So there are various networks that are there, and I believe those association and network are the second most important way to stay up to date. A third way that I use is basically by subscribing to newsletter and regularly reading publication on the language industry. And some of the popular newsletter that I would like to recommend, we have Multilingual, which is the leader in the industry. We have publication from Cabot that are focused, on the language industry. We also have Bolingo podcast, like the one that we are doing now. If you like to know what's happening in the language industry, follow the previous episode, of this podcast focusing on African languages. Bolingo also, as we know, has, localization guides that are being produced on a regular basis. It can also help anyone who would like to learn what is happening in that industry. So I believe that publication, newsletter are a third way of learning about what's happening and staying up to date. A fourth way is basically engaging with your colleagues. It's dangerous to work in isolation. I remember the last time I came in Bolingo office, I met Renato Beninato, who is the founder of Nimzi Insight. And you can't believe it. Later on, I reached out to him and he accepted to be my mentor. And I've learned tremendously from him in refining our marketing approach and so many things that we were doing which could have been improved. A fifth way, and the last one, which I think is a good way of staying up to date, is basically experimenting. So yes, you can read, yes, you can learn, yes, you can network, but you have to practice, experiment new tools and technology. For example, there is this trend of how ChatGPT is used, to facilitate translation, interpretation, and the work. Are we practicing it? How do we integrate NLP in our work? How do we integrate machine translation? So those tools that are out there from SmartCard and many other tools, computer-assisted tools, let's go out for it and let's choose those that are relevant for our needs. It's not because a tool is new technology that is necessarily important. So I believe that, by following those 5 key elements, one will always be up to date and know what's going on in the industry and take proactive measure and decision. Thank you.
Beautiful. I'm particularly excited that you mentioned some events, associations, and network opportunities happening in the industry. So as a spin-off of my earlier question on trends and developments in the industry, I know there's a lot of amazing stuff happening in the industry at the moment. But in your opinion, what is the one most exciting development currently happening in the language service industry?
Wow, this is quite difficult because there are so many things happening, that are exciting. But I think one of them will be, the increased focus on machine translation and natural language processing. I think those two technologies are helping to make translation to be more easy, to accelerate the delivery, of the work that we are doing as LSP, and to also ensure that high volume of work is being processed in the short amount of time. These tools, which are currently present, are making the work so easy. But I think that we have to pay attention to how these tools are being developed and make sure that we are following and that we are also up to date. Recently, my head of unit was writing an article on the fact that, AI, or these tools are not going to replace human translation. Because we realize that today, when you are using DeepL Translator, the quality is so good that you can't even realize that this was done by a machine. We also have Quillbot, which also an AI tool which paraphrase and do so many things, But one of the tools that I will highly recommend, as a trend to follow in this year and the year to come is OB Translate. Yes, OB Translate is, a machine translation tool that is developed by a Nigerian in the person of Emmanuel Gabriel, and he has this very ambitious goal of translating over 2,000 African languages. When I was discussing with him and he told me that, I say, wow, this is something that needs to be supported. And I believe that every African linguist, everyone who is working in the African language industry must join hands with him because, yes, we can use tools that are existing, but we must make sure that we also create local or indigenous tool to also advance African languages. Nobody is going to do it for us. So we have to do it ourselves or support those who are making that happening, So I think machine translation and NLP are key things that we have to pay attention to. There are more, but since you said one, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Christian. I understand also that you describe yourself as a learning futurist. Honestly, I had no idea what that meant until I looked it up. And I found out that it means that you leverage foresight skills and available data to kind of suggest insights into potential future learning methods or technologies and strategies. Great. With this in mind, I would love to hear your thoughts on the future of the language service industry. As a KM consultant and learning futurist, are there any emerging trends that you anticipate or even existing ones that you believe will become significant in the coming years?
Okay. Interesting. So, yes, I think from a knowledge management perspective, in the next few years, there are, I think, let's say, four key trends that I see that we have to pay attention to. Number one, we realize that there is an increase in demand for translation and interpretation services, because, more businesses are going global and we have a rise of e-commerces across the world, meaning that more companies are going to seek out for, the need of making their content available in multiple languages. So I believe that this increase in demand is going automatically to create more opportunities for those who are in the language industry. Of course, we know that AI is also making things easily, but we should not neglect that AI without human is useless. I think the second thing that we have to pay attention to from a knowledge management perspective is the fact that there will be a greater focus on localization and cultural sensitivity. Why am I saying that? I'm saying this because, more people want to read content in terms, in a context, in a flavor that they recognize. Many people want to read content in their own language, with their own sensitivity reflected in it. So this is a challenge that we have to pay attention to. And this is where, NLP is coming to make language translation and interpretation to look more natural. A third trend that we are observing also is the fact that we see more and more, collaboration, and I would even dare to say integration between different industry. So, for example, realize that there are industry who are more, customer support oriented or marketing oriented, that are adding language services in the way that they are working. I have seen more and more, for example, customer support services that are integrating automatic translation tools, to make sure that whenever clients are reaching out to the company, they can read or have access to information in their own languages. We have chatbots, who are now available in various languages. We also have e-commerce platforms that are also available in various languages and even social media pages. For example, when you go on LinkedIn, you realize that they have various languages that are available aside English. So these are some of the trends that I believe we have to pay attention to. But the most important one is artificial intelligence, machine translation, and natural language processing. And I emphasize again that as an African language professional, it's important to be part of the game. And Masakane Land Africa of Chris Emezue are interesting initiative where we need to be part of it to see how best, we can also create those tools. We are not called to be consumers, but we are also called to create the tools that we need. And in that regard, I would like to invite those who are following us that there will be the Deep Learning Africa Conference. It's a conference where tech enthusiasts and people who are working on African languages, from various perspectives are coming together to reflect on the last tools, the last practices, the last technology that have been created. The event is going to be hosted in Ghana. So if you are, interested, just go online, type Deep Learning in Daba, and register for it and join us in Accra for interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. This is really enlightening. And one thing you said that struck a chord with me was the potential for collaborations with other industries. When you made that point, it immediately reminded me of a long-standing concern I've had with the Western movie industry and how they portray African languages and culture in their movies. The West has always made movies about Africa and Africans, and we tend to see more of this in recent times, which, don't get me wrong, I'm excited about. However, it is the how that bothers me. There's this popular Hollywood movie that's made waves in the past year. In a scene in this movie, we see an African woman approach and refer to a young lady as small girl in a seemingly Nigerian accent. And I was like, I'm not Nigerian, but even I know that no Nigerian meets a young lady and calls her that. It will probably make sense if you meet a bunch of young ladies and call them small girls, but certainly not in this context. I noticed the same thing in another Kiswahili English Hollywood movie that's set in Kenya.
Okay.
And it features an American actress who doesn't originally speak Kiswahili as a main character. That's another concern I have, but I won't go into that today. Anyways, in one scene, we see this lady who was a teacher welcoming a new student into her class. She looks at the new student and says, "Karibuni," in her bid to say welcome. It didn't sit well with me, so I checked with my colleague at the time, who is a native Kiswahili speaker, and she confirmed that you cannot say karibuni when you're referring to one person. We also see another example of this in another recently popular Hollywood movie set in Africa, where we see American actors who are supposed to be portraying the history and culture of the Dahomey Kingdom of Benin, rather forcing accents which seem Nigerian and Eastern African. They even got some parts of the story wrong and messed up the names of some ancestral gods. It made me wonder, who were their language consultants? Who was in charge of originality and cultural sensitivity? was this person originally from Africa? And from these tribes they are trying to portray. And that brings me to my question for you, Christian. What should the African language industry do to curtail these unfortunate but rather prevalent issues? I may have a follow-up to this depending on how your response goes.
Interesting. I think when you were developing the question, there are many thoughts that come to that came to mind. The first thought that came to mind was actually something that my mom used to say. My mom is a francophone in Cameroon. She used to say that c'est la patate qui avait accepté qu'on la mange crue. It's like, it is potato that has accepted to be eaten freshly, without being cooked. Meaning that, if I want to replicate it to the statement I want to make, it is African who are allowing to be mistreated or to be neglected or to be underestimated,
Exactly.
For example, let me just use a parallel or an analogy. Have you realized that you would difficultly find a Western movie where maybe, a white person is simulating an Indian or a Japanese? No. They will always make sure that when it comes to other races or other groups, they bring on board people who actually come from that group so that those people can effectively communicate in the appropriate language, with the appropriate idiolect, with the appropriate manners, So if they are doing that for when it comes to other culture, it is because they know the implication in case there are error, in case there are glitches, they know the implications are going to be huge. But when it comes to Africa, that same concern, that same attention to details is not replicated. And I believe it is the consequence of the mindset. Unconsciously, everything that we do is influenced by what we think, So if they think lowly of us, it's natural that they will just go about doing it with what they have, using people who are not from the country or from the culture just to make it happen, and even make sure that the money stay within, their cycle. And that is why, I believe that from the language industry component, which is the angle that we are talking about here, because the debate is huge. It's not just in the language industry. There are many other aspects where we see those things happening. But in the language service industry, what needs to be done from this perspective is the need to have a strong voice, a strong network, to have what we call, a common platform where we can have standard practices. We can make it in such a way that it becomes difficult, to think or work on any movie or any cultural product where African languages are, integrated without going, for a language consultant that can confirm the quality of what is being said in it, But when we come to Africa, we realize that, most of what we see in the language industry is isolation. We have a network of African translator in East Africa. We have one in South Africa, but in Central Africa, we have none. In West Africa also, very few that I know. Even in Ghana, Gatti, we used to be prominent, has almost died in terms of effectiveness. So we need those common platforms. And that's the reason why Cabot Group has taken the initiative of putting in place, the Association of Language Company in Africa together with, Multilingual Consult, because we realize that alone, yes, we can go fast, but together we can go far. Yes, it's important to work in union. It's important to work together, because there are certain challenges. There are certain issues that alone you cannot address it. You can't go alone in the movie industry and attempt to change the practices that are being done there. So we need a stronger platform to conduct advocacy, awareness, so that people will know the implication and know the consequences, of not abiding to cultural sensitivity. And I will use this platform to invite anyone who would like to join the Association of Language Company in Africa to reach out to us via Cabot Group or Multilingual Consult or the Alert Group on LinkedIn. And we are going to be pleased to work together with you so that we can be stronger and avoid these nonsenses of happening in the future.
Solid point there, Christian. Thank you. So now here's my follow-up question. There's an account proverb that goes like, "Sayebo dama yebo fifie," which is figuratively synonymous to the English saying, "Charity begins at home." To wit, you clean your own backyard before you go about cleaning others. You've made some good points about how, as an industry, we can ensure that contents produced about Africa and Africans are culturally sensitive. Now, how can African language service providers ensure that our own services are always culturally and linguistically appropriate for the diverse communities we serve in Africa.
Okay. Now, when it comes to, how African language service providers can adapt our offer, to be culturally and linguistically appropriate for the diverse community that we serve in Africa, is very important because I believe, as we know, we have almost more than 2,000 languages that are spoken in Africa, which means that particularities, for those languages are very moving from one country to the other. So some of the things that I believe that could be done for we to ensure that our services are more effective is, number one, to hire linguists that have local knowledge of the language, linguists that are trained in those languages. And, when it comes to Africa, it's something a bit difficult. Do you know why?
Tell me, sir.
Because you are going to realize that even though we have over 2,000 languages that have been spoken, it is difficult to find people who are able of writing and speaking fluently those languages. Most of the African language experts, they are expert at verbal speaking, like verbal expert. But when it comes to the writing, very few have that expertise in knowing how to transcribe, knowing how to write, knowing how to master the grammar, the syntax of their language, and this is a gap. Because how can we, for example, translate text in local languages if the people who are speaking cannot write it? It's a barrier, it's a challenge, So this is a call for African university, for, people who are working in the area of African languages to train more and to systematize, to develop standards, to develop vocabulary so that our language can be learnable, so that our language can be accessible, so that our language can be, available for anyone who would like to tap into it. The second thing is to develop glossary and style guide, that are specific to the culture, So, for example, even though, we are in Ghana, we have the Twi and many other languages, there are some nuances, So it's important to have glossary that clearly determine which words belongs to which type of language, and how to go about when to use those languages. So it's important to do it in partnership with the local speakers of those languages. A third element is to do training on cultural, linguistic. It's important to train people. How do you work as a cultural linguist? What are the peculiarities when translating in different languages? A fourth element, is to engage with the local community. You can't serve what you don't know. You can't serve appropriately African communities without knowing their priorities, without knowing their needs. So for example, if we take the case of the Akan News website that Bolingo has developed, it's important before creating news content on that website to know what is the primary interest of Akan people, because it is a website that is developed in Akan language. So it's good to know the people speaking that language, what type of content would they like to have access to, and to design the offer around that, And the fifth element is to leverage on the power of technology, to facilitate this work. Technology today is unavoidable. So it's important that in everything that we do, technology should be at the center of it. And if the technological tools are not existing, let's go forth and create them. We have brains and we are able of creating the tools that are needed. And again, what Obi Translate is doing is commendable in that regard. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Amazing. The details, man. I really appreciate that. Now, before we leave, what advice would you give to someone who is just starting out in the language service industry in Africa? Whether as a translator, interpreter, or instructional designer, and so on.
Yeah, I think advice for those coming, in the industry, or those who are already in the industry, I think let's say 7 key advices. The first one is to master your art. You can't be a librarian without knowing the science of managing a library, So you cannot be a language professional without mastering languages, Not necessarily certificates. Certificates are good, maybe for industry standard, but master your thing, master the language that you are specializing in. The number 2 is to stay up to date. Because if you are not up to date, then you'll be outdated. And we all know that even with antivirus, when the antivirus is not updated, attack can easily come in and destroy. So you have to stay up to date, The number 3, build your network. I've already indicated some platforms that can facilitate that. Now, the fourth element is to specialize. One thing I've realized with most people when they start their career in the language industry is that they want to embrace everything. They want to be in the legal translation, health translation, book translation, and you cannot be good everywhere. Be known for something, stand out, find your niche and stay in it and become the top expert in that niche. My fifth advice is invest in your professional development. This is something that I learned from Renato, The last time we were having our meeting, he was indicating to me how his company, Nimsy Insight, has mostly grew through the network, that he developed at industry events. So he realized that going in person to language industry event is more profitable than attending events online. Because when you go in person, you can build genuine and real relationship with the people. And when people are looking for services, they remember first the people they know, So if you are not known, then nobody will contact you. So invest in yourself. If there's an event where you have to pay to attend for it, pay it. It's going to generate a return on investment. My sixth advice is to focus on quality. I believe that you cannot lie someone twice,
First fool, no be fool.
Exactly, So someone can give you a translation or interpretation project the first time, but the quality of the delivery will determine whether the person will come back or not. So rather than making noise in advertising yourself, yes, it is good, but make sure that every assignment, every engagement, every work that your hands pass on, is delivered with strong professionalism and excellent quality. And finally, build your reputation. It is no use to be good and nobody knows about you. It's like you have a jewel, but nobody have ever seen it. So we have platforms, we have network, we have pros, we have Alert, we have LinkedIn. We have so many networks out there. Choose those that are relevant to you and make sure that you are active on it. I've seen many translators and interpreters from Africa who are on LinkedIn, but they never post. They are just there not doing anything. They are just reading what others are doing. A thought leader cannot influence thinking without creating new knowledge. So if you are silent, you will be silenced. So you have to stand out and build your reputation on a gradual but consistent basis. If you do those 7 things, I'm sure that in the years to come, nobody will be able of doing without you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Christian, for sharing your knowledge with us. I actually have tons of questions that need your wisdom, and I think we may have to have a part 2 of this session another time to discuss those. Thank you once again for being on Africa's LSP podcast.
You're welcome.
We will share your LinkedIn profile as well as links to some of the events, associations, and networking opportunities you spoke about for the perusal of our listeners.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you too for the opportunity, and I really encourage anyone listening to follow this podcast. It's a very great initiative for anyone in the African language industry to stay up to trend, to know what's happening. And I really appreciate the initiative, and more grace to all of the team behind this.
Thanks for tuning in to Africa's LSP podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. For feedback or enquiries, reach out to us at podcast@bolingoconsult.com. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite platforms. Until next time, stay curious and keep growing.